We begin now chapter 17. This is the third chapter in this term, and here we begin to move forward still in the present and the indicative, but some important notes along the way, and especially in how certain letters function in relation to one another and how that helps us to understand a verb. So let's begin by reviewing. You've seen this slide before. There are three components to the Greek verb: the stem, and that carries the meaning, the connecting vowel, and the personal ending that corresponds to that tense form. Still reviewing: the stem, the most basic element, and then the connecting vowel. Remember, the connecting vowel is omicron if the stem ending is mu or nu, or there is no personal ending. Otherwise, it's epsilon. So you're seeing already that knowing the personal endings is very important in identifying the connecting vowel, and we'll see that that helps us to know the stem of a word. And here's what you've seen already in Mounts if you have it open in chapter 17. Contract verbs are those, they're rare, but they are important. They're the rare instances when a stem ends in one of three vowels, an alpha, an epsilon, or an omicron. Normally, stems end in a consonant. And what follows that consonant? It's the connecting vowel, and then the personal ending. And so it's not a problem because the consonant meets with the connecting vowel and then the personal ending, and there's no contraction. But if that stem ends in alpha, epsilon, or omega, we have two vowels beside each other, and those contract. Those contract, though, along five patterns, if you will, or there are five rules, primary rules. There are a few more, but we want you to focus on these five, and you'll be well on your way if you know these. The first contraction that takes place is omicron upsilon. That's what it looks like, oo, and you'll notice that there's a circumflex over the word, and that gives you a clue that there's a contraction. Well, how do we know what the stem is, the stem of the word, so I can identify the meaning? We identify that stem by looking at the contraction, looking at our personal ending, and from that personal ending we can remember then what the connecting vowel is. And so in identifying the connecting vowel, you have half of what contracts. Once you identify half of what contracts, then you can find what is missing. So in this case, if the contraction is oo, and you know the connecting vowel is omicron, you need to memorize what lies behind that is an epsilon. That's what's missing, and in this case, poe, the epsilon is the contract vowel, and you see that's underlined there in the final column. Go to the second example there, plerute. Te, we know that epsilon is the connecting vowel, so we're halfway there. If we have an oo as the result and the epsilon is one element, what else, what contracts with to get oo? It's omicron. And you see that that is underlined there, plera. And plerumen, the connecting vowel, omicron, so you have an omicron with an omicron to get omicron upsilon, circumflex over that, oo. That's the first and most common of the contractions. Second, poete, connecting vowels epsilon. You have epsilon, epsilon together, and that contracts to epsilon iota or poete from poe. The stem is going to end in epsilon. The third example is an omega, and that omega has a circumflex. That clues you it's a contract verb. In this case, agapomen is our example. We have agapomen. We notice that the primary, or the ending there, the primary ending in this case, begins with mu. That must have omicron as a connecting vowel. Omicron plus what contracts to the omega? In this case, it's the alpha. You just need to memorize that, as well as a number of other vowels there. Omega swallows up a number of vowels, as Mounce notes. The fourth rule for the alpha, agapate, epsilon is the connecting vowel. What plus epsilon contracts to an alpha with a circumflex? In this case, it is the alpha, alpha plus epsilon, agapa. And the third singular, the iota subscripts down underneath the alpha. The final rule, eta, poie, again you have that iota subscript, ea, go together, contract to eta. And epsilon becomes the contract vowel. These patterns will become more familiar to you in the days ahead, and just as you memorize them, you'll need to know them this week. So just memorize the contraction patterns, but don't fret, as Mounce notes, and I think very clearly in chapter 17 here. If you know the personal ending, which I've underlined here in this slide, if you know the personal ending, then you will be able to know the connecting vowel. If you know the connecting vowel, you're halfway to knowing what that stem ends in, what vowel the stem would end in. So just know those patterns in that regard. I'm going to come back to this slide for a minute. Once you know the connecting vowel and you have the lexical form in front of you, you're halfway there. Just then memorize that epsilon omicron go to u, omicron epsilon go to u, omicron omicron go to u, epsilon epsilon to a, alpha and omicron omicron plus about any combination goes to omega, and then the last two as well. The master personal ending chart, keep this in mind. Know these endings. The primary active, luo, lues, lue, luamen, luete, lusen, oase, amenete, usen. And keep in mind that third plural is nsi. You'll just need to memorize these. I've mentioned the vocab in the past and vocab starters here. Encourage you to use as many senses as possible in memorizing vocabulary. Think of word pictures, think of ideas, think of sights, smells, sounds. And come up with creative combinations. Agapao, one bridge that could help you to memorize this. A gap, if you like the store A Gap. Well, I love it. I love the gap. Baseball, hit the ball in the gap. I love to hit the baseball in the gap. I can get a base hit, maybe a double. Diamonion, it sounds like demon, and that's what it is. Zeteo, zeal. I seek, or I desire. These are just a few examples. Come up with your own. I'd encourage you to write these out and then put them into a voice recorder of some kind, perhaps on your phone or a digital voice recorder, and go over them. You will be amazed at how quickly you can memorize large amounts of vocabulary if you're creative. And I trust that you will work at that. That wraps up chapter 17 then, the contract verbs and a bit of vocabulary.